I thought it would be helpful to do something today just about something that we see often enough in projects. I'm just going to do this first part, narrowing the scope. And Professor Kruger, I know we talked about this earlier. If you want to say some things about humbling the conclusion or making the conclusion more modest, or that can be kind of a conversation among us. But narrowing the scope, especially I'm thinking of philosophy papers, one of the easy mistakes to make is to try to be too ambitious in the project. So I've just put a couple examples of an approach to a project that's too ambitious, too broad, and then how you might narrow that. And I think it's kind of hard to be too narrow at this point, or that shouldn't be your worry that you're being too narrow. You don't want to be so narrow that it's meaningless. But I would say the knee-jerk reaction for students early on in philosophy is to be too ambitious, too broad. So I would say make that your concern. Ask yourself, am I being too broad rather than am I being too narrow? So examples are, instead of saying time and again throughout history, you know, this is something we all agree to, or this is what has happened. Instead of that, we can limit it to like, hey, during the 2010 State of the Union address, President Obama noted blah, 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 blah. And then we've narrowed our scope to, we're only talking about this address. And we might even say, during the first 5 minutes of this address, or during the address where he was talking about this, I'm going to be saying something about that. So you go from broad to narrow, and that makes your job easier because now you're kind of telling the audience, I'm not going to be talking about all these other things, and I'm letting you know that from the outset, so you don't expect that. And just a couple other examples. So instead of saying movies are all capitalist propaganda, kind of a big, broad, sweeping statement, you could say, okay, the film Wall Street, especially personified by this one character, especially in this one scene. In fact, I'm only going to be talking about this one scene and what this character does in this one scene to show the capitalist propaganda in this one scene. And this character does X, Y, and Z, and here's why that's capitalist propaganda. So again, we go from this broad sweeping statement, this broad sweeping scope to we're just talking about this. And then the last one that should feel familiar to those of you who've taken Intro to Philosophy, instead of saying something like, modern philosophers don't understand basic logic, we can say, Descartes' leap to the conclusion that he exists because he's thinking is flawed for these reasons, as Hume noted, something like that, where we're not going to talk about all of Descartes. We're certainly not talking about all of modern philosophy. We're just talking about this one part of his argument and trying to address that. So just a brief instruction on projects is narrow your scope. It should be a help to make your project more straightforward, more manageable, and more kind of precise. So anyway, those are some thoughts on narrowing the scope. I don't know, Professor Kruger, if you want to say a word or two on humbling the conclusion, or if we want to just jump to projects.
I think now is a good time. I'll just take up 2 minutes because it attaches very well to narrowing the scope. And that is, the conclusion should be at least soft at this point. So even if you feel that you've said the logic used by Descartes doesn't work, the conclusion is not that he's therefore wrong. The conclusion is that you've successfully shown that his logic is unconvincing. Or if you compare three philosophers or three theoreticians of any sort, and you argue in favor of one, the conclusion is not that this one is therefore perfect or the best, just that amongst the three, this one is able to face up to criticism better than the other two. And so it softens the claim, and this goes hand in hand with narrowing the scope. If you wanted to show that in Wall Street, the film, in this one scene, this character is an example of capitalist propaganda because of X, Y, and Z, you can say, and therefore, in this case, in this scene, he can be understood as doing capitalist propaganda, and not that he is therefore a capitalist pig who should be in a gulag. Because to argue that next point will take you another 10 pages, which is certainly not the point.